The German General Staff was the most admired military institution on earth, and it looked at his idea and saw fantasy. The Inspector of Transport Troops, General Otto Stülp-Nagel, forbade the theoretical handling of tanks in any formation larger than a regiment. His reasoning was recorded plainly. A Panzer Division was a utopian dream. Another senior officer told the same young theorist that motorized troops were supposed to carry flour. That verdict was not eccentric. It was the settled opinion of every major army in the world. Tanks existed to walk beside infantry at infantry pace, and an army that believed that would fight the next war at the speed of the last one. The officer being dismissed had never commanded a tank in battle. He was a signals man and a staff man. Heinz Guderian, the one his crews would come to call Schneller Heinz, Hurrying Heinz. He was sacked in 1941. He quarreled with almost every superior he ever had. And yet, 6 weeks after his theory was finally tested at full scale, France had surrendered, and within a decade, every serious army on earth had rebuilt itself around the thing his own general staff had called a utopian dream. So what did a signals officer understand that the general staff did not? 3 operations answer it, and the first one is a river crossing. The river was the Meuse, and the French had already decided that nobody could reach it in a hurry. The forest of the Ardennes stood in front of it. Marshal Philippe Pétain had called that forest impenetrable to a modern army. French planning allowed 5 to 9 days for a force to come through it. The German staff's own estimate was that a crossing could not be attempted before the 9th day. Guderian said 4. His corps was standing on the bank in 2.5. The sector at Sedan belonged to the French Second Army under General Charles Hunt Sigeuer, and he believed it was the safest ground he held. His best formations were away on his right, watching for a thrust behind the Maginot Line. The river in front of Sedan was covered by the 55th Infantry Division, a second-grade reserve formation, near the bottom of the list for anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns, and by 103 concrete pillboxes. He was guarding the wrong place with his good troops. Guderian did not begin by arguing about tanks. He began by arguing about aircraft. Göring had promised 8 hours of massed bombing before the crossing. One enormous blow. Guderian refused it. He asked instead for continuous waves of smaller strength, hour after hour, so that no French gunner would ever get a quiet minute to lift his head and lay a gun. He got what he asked for. More than 300 dive bomber sorties went in across that afternoon. Behind him, 60,000 men, 771 tanks, and 41,000 vehicles were being funneled onto a handful of forest roads in a column that reached back to the Rhine. Nothing about it was subtle. Everything about it was pointed at one bend in one river. 0 hour was 4 in the afternoon on the 13th of May, 1940. The infantry went first, wading a waterlogged meadow with rubber boats held over their heads, and a great many of those boats were shot to pieces before they ever touched the water. If the crossing failed, there would be no bridge and no tanks on the far bank, and the whole campaign would sit stranded on the wrong side of a river. Every officer on that shore knew it. On the 10th Panzer front, the assault stalled outright. A sergeant named Walther Rubarth went forward with 11 men, 5 engineers, and 6 riflemen, and took 7 bunkers, one after another. 6 of the 11 were hit. He was given the Knight's Cross. When Guderian himself crossed later that day in a rubber boat, Lieutenant Colonel Hermann Balk met him on the far bank and greeted him with his own training ground reprimand, quoted back at him word for word. Joyriding in canoes on the Meuse is forbidden. Then came the thing that no plan contained. At about 7 that evening, on a ridge at Bulson, 10 kilometers behind the river, a rumor reached the 295th Regiment that German tanks were already behind them. No German tank had crossed the river. The regiment ran anyway, and it took the divisional artillery with it, the same guns that were covering the crossing sites. The Germans did not attack that ridge until 20 minutes past 7 the following morning. The bombardment that produced this collapse had killed almost nobody. French casualties inside the bunkers came to 56 men. What the aircraft destroyed was telephone cable laid in the open and the confidence of a second-grade division that had been told it was safe. German losses around Sedan between the 12th and the 17th of May came to 5,067 killed and wounded, and 81 rubber boats. That was the method, and it never changed. Concentrate everything at one point. Drive deeper than the enemy believes possible. Never stop to consolidate. Subscribe if you want more of these, because the next order to reach him did not come from the French. It came from his own side, and it told him to stop. He had been told to stop before the bridgehead was a day old. General von Kleist wanted it limited to 8 kilometers and then consolidated. Guderian wanted 20 kilometers and then a run for the sea. Kleist ordered the halt. Guderian offered to resign his command on the spot. General Wilhelm List was sent to settle it, and what he produced was a piece of deliberate language rather than a decision. Guderian could continue, on paper, as a reconnaissance in force. Guderian took the phrase and moved a corps with it. Then he had a telephone wire strung from his own advancing command post back to his fixed headquarters so that his orders would travel by cable, and no radio recall could catch him on the move. The man who built his reputation on radio spent that week making certain the radio could not reach him. There was a reason he could move faster than the men above him could think. A French armored division that wanted to change direction stopped, gathered its officers, and issued the change on paper. Every German tank in Guderian's corps carried a radio. He rode inside his own column in an armored half-track with a cipher machine bolted into it and gave orders to divisions while all of them were still moving. The signals officer had built an armored force around the only thing he had ever specialized in. What followed is the reason the word Blitzkrieg exists in English. On the 20th of May, the 2nd Panzer Division covered 90 kilometers in a single day, about 56 miles, on roads clogged with refugees. At 2 in the morning on the 21st, a reconnaissance detachment reached the sea at Noyelles-sur-Mer, from the edge of a forest that had been called impenetrable to the Atlantic coast, in 10 days. It was not clean. On the 17th of May at Montcornet, a French armored counterattack under Colonel Charles de Gaulle came into the flank of the 1st Panzer Division and cost the Germans between 40 and 50 tanks in a morning. Crews were sleeping beside their vehicles in shifts, refueling from captured stocks, and a large share of the tanks reported lost on that drive were not destroyed at all, but broken down and waiting for recovery. That distinction mattered more than anyone realized at the time. On the 24th of May, the halt order came, and this one held. Fourth Army had proposed it, Rundstedt issued it, and Hitler confirmed it the same day. The reasons given were the state of the armor, the marshy canal ground ahead, alarm at the British counterattack at Arras 3 days earlier, and Göring's claim that his aircraft could finish the job alone. Dunkirk was to be left to the Luftwaffe. Guderian recorded that he was speechless. The force being rested was less broken than the order assumed. More than 330,000 Allied soldiers were lifted off those beaches while the panzers sat still. Guderian had cut the Allied armies in half in 10 days. He had not destroyed the army trapped inside the pocket. Study the ground the enemy has written off. Put everything through the one point he is not watching, then refuse to stop while he is still deciding what has happened. There was one accusation that followed him for the rest of his career, and it was that he only understood one direction, forward, and that he could not be governed by anyone. The Ukraine, in the late summer of 1941, is the answer to it. It is also the strangest entry on his record because it is the operation he argued against. On the 23rd of August, 1941, he flew to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, intending to argue for Moscow. He argued and he lost. He came out having agreed to take his panzer group south instead, into the Ukraine, and told his own staff that there had been nothing he could do and that he had to give in. Franz Halder, the chief of the general staff, took it as a personal betrayal and asked the Army's commander-in-chief to resign alongside him. The commander-in-chief declined. Then Guderian went and executed the plan he had just spent a day trying to prevent. The 2 previous encirclements had exposed the weakness in his own method. At Minsk in June and at Smolensk in July, The panzers had closed the ring far ahead of the marching infantry, and, while the two arms waited for each other, Soviet troops walked out through the gaps in the dark. The pockets leaked. A pincer that arrives early and then waits is not a trap. It is a suggestion. So the Ukraine was run as one continuous movement. 2nd Panzer Group turned south across the Desna in autumn rain on roads that turned to grease under the first vehicle and had to be corduroyed with cut timber for the ones behind. It drove roughly 190 kilometers beyond the flank of the Soviet armies at Kiev, past the point where any sensible staff would have halted to secure a shoulder. On the 16th of September, at Lokvitsia, its leading division met the leading division of Kleist's 1st Panzer Group coming north. 4 Soviet armies were inside the ring, and the ring did not open. General Mikhail Kirponos, commanding the Soviet Southwestern Front, was killed trying to break out of it. The German command claimed 665,000 prisoners. The historian David Stahel argues that figure was inflated for propaganda and that the true number is closer to 500,000. Take the lower one, and it is still roughly 20,000 men taken prisoner every day for a month from a single operation. The price was paid in a currency the German army could not replace. 25,000 German dead in 9 days of that summer's fighting, tanks worn out beyond repair rather than shot out, and above all, the calendar. By the time the Ukraine was finished, the season for Moscow had gone. In December, the ground froze 5 feet down. His men had no winter clothing, and Guderian pulled them back to defensible positions against direct orders. He was relieved of command on the 26th of December, 1941. Concentrate. Drive deeper. Never stop. The verdict is complicated, and it is more honest to say so. The loudest praise came after the war from the British theorist Basil Liddell Hart, who wrote glowingly of Guderian, while Guderian was crediting Liddell Hart with inspiring him, which makes both men unreliable witnesses for each other. The reliable testimony is duller and heavier. The German General Staff that had ruled a Panzer Division, a utopian dream, rewrote its own manuals around it. And so, within 10 years, did the armies that had beaten him. The flaw is heavier still. Guderian wrote after the war that the criminal orders for the campaign in the Soviet Union never reached his command and were never obeyed by it. The surviving records do not support him. His headquarters passed those orders down like every other headquarters on that front. In July 1944, he sat on the court of honor that expelled fellow officers from the army so that Hitler's People's Court could hang them. His memoirs became a bestseller in the West, and one of the foundation stones of the myth that the German army fought a clean war. The German General Staff spent a decade telling Heinz Guderian that motorized troops were supposed to carry flour and that a Panzer Division was a utopian dream. It spent 6 weeks in the summer of 1940 watching the utopian dream carry France. What is your favorite tactical move by Guderian? And which commander should I cover next?